It's my pleasure to welcome you to this tour of Gerd Metzdorff's collection. The exhibition titled Per Diem, the Gerd Metzdorff Collection, runs until the beginning of May 8th. And I am very pleased to take you through a tour of the exhibition today. I'm Lisa Baldissera, Curator, Director of Griffin Art Projects and Curator of the exhibition. I want to start with this image of Gerd Metzdorff and tell you just a little bit about him as we look at the image. This is a portrait by Christos Dikiakos, and this was produced in the year of just before he died in 2020. And what we can see in this image is Gerd Metzdorff pictured in his living room, surrounded by his collection. And this is a small West End apartment. And very much like Herb and Dorothy Vogel, he was a collector of almost 300 works, living in this very small space and collecting on a very modest income. The per diem was a per diem that he received through his work as an airline steward starting in the late 70s, and then going on his routes from Vancouver to Dusseldorf and Cologne, and then also Vancouver to New York. So as a result of those kinds of vectors, he was able to bring art home to Canada, some of which isn't widely exhibited even to this day in this country. So it's really interesting to see these layered kinds of different artists, different nationalities in this collection, from American, Canadian, and primarily German continental European artists. Gerd Metzdorff started early collecting stamps and coins, and he also collected art books from the 1940s to the 1960s. And as part of that collection, what he would do was he was very interested in doing research, and I think the beginning of that kind of interest in the archive and interest in research started there. He was very interested in the Group of Seven, and then quickly realized that that was probably not something that he would be able to afford to collect, and began collecting contemporary work, starting with early conceptual work from the 60s and 70s, and then moving into minimalism, pop art, post-minimalism, and most of it very conceptually based work, along with some very formalist kinds of works within the conceptual tradition. So very wide-ranging streams, which we'll look at as we go through the exhibition today. Gerd Metzdorff was invited to have his portrait taken by not only Christos, but also Andy Warhol, Thomas Roof, and Robert Mapplethorpe. And he was refused all of these invitations, which reveals something about his retiring nature and his sense of privacy. So we're just delighted to be able to show within this exhibition and an exhibition next year in 2023, a wide selection of the works from that almost 300-piece collection for the first time to the public. So I'm going to go through and show you some of the larger works, the larger streams of his preoccupations. I also want to just point out as we go by this Brian Youngen work, which really shows Gerd's interest in artists at the beginning of their careers. So this is one of Brian's mask works, which was based on his critique of commodity culture and its use of indigenous imagery. And it's kind of a classic mask work by Youngen, and also showing that sort of the beginnings of his work in this kind of using this kind of sculptural pastiche, and opening up to other readings of the way popular culture informs and also capitalizes on indigeneity. So I'm going to go through and we'll have a look at some of the works in this room. I'm going to start with Jason McLean's work. And the room itself really is, these three walls have a strong sense of the street and the urban, and that kind of edge that seems to dominate a number of these kind of critical stances in the works, where they're looking at this sort of intersection of political, cultural, and social forces as they exist kind of within the urban fabric. And Jason McLean, he was a graduate of Emily Carr, and he did these sort of mind maps that really reflected on his encounters as he went about his life. And this is one of the earlier large-scale pieces which Gerd collected right at that start of Jason's career. And it shows a sort of a classic MacLean work, and that it shows these kinds of imaginative and text-based and image-based sort of ruminations on the world at large as he experiences it. And there's a kind of edge to those experiences as well, and we can sort of see that in a number of the works in the exhibition. So for example, if you look at the Jenny Holzer work, which is behind me here, this is also part of her early street interventions, and this work was done 1979 to 1982, which was really before she was very well known, and she used wheat paste to poster these around New York City in the middle of the night and was once arrested for doing so. And these are these short essays that were taken from her time studying at the Whitney when she was being introduced to many different kinds of philosophical thought. So here we have excerpts from Mao, from Lenin, from Hitler, from Trotsky, and they're all smashed together in these kinds of what she calls inflammatory essays. So again, a project that looks at the street, that urban fabric, and looks and suggests these different ways that people can kind of engage with one another on the street. At that time, they actually did, and she said people would underline different sections of the text and actually, stand and look at them. They were all unauthored. She didn't indicate that she was the author at all, and of course the texts eventually kind of fall apart and that they contradict one another. And that kind of interrogation of contemporary life, that sort of really unapologetic kind of directness, is to be found in a number of the works in Gerd's collection that he was attracted to. And yet at the same time you can see things like Vija Selman's work. And this really talks to his interest, as Jason MacLean's does, in drawing. So Vija Selman's work is a much more kind of minimalist, reflective, kind of contemplative work. And it is sort of a classic work of hers, this meditative piece. So it really shows you the range of how Metzdorff was thinking about the kinds of work that he was collecting. And within even a genre like drawing, he would think about the different range that was possible within that genre. Similarly, we can look here at Robert Rauschenberg's work. This is a small print. There are 3 works in the exhibition. And this small print, again, combines, this is a print, but it does combine those kind of gestures of drawing and the kind of assemblage that Rauschenberg is known for. Above it is a small piece that was something that was kind of a special gift, and this was Gerd on his way to meet Andy Warhol for a special party, picked up a can of cream of chicken soup and brought it to the party and asked Warhol if he would sign it, and he did. So you can see that it's addressed to Gerd and signed by Warhol. And that talks a little bit about how Gerd's relationships with different artists evolved. He became friends of different collectors like Herb and Dorothy Vogel, who incidentally we will be showing a film series curated by our adjunct curator Karen Tam in March, on March 6th and 20th. We'll show 2 of the films on Herb and Dorothy Vogel. And there's a real resonance, also a small apartment, large collection, and again, this kind of milieu that Gerd was moving in. Part of his interest was also bringing artists to Vancouver. So he was one of the co-founders of Contemporary Art Vancouver, the Contemporary Art Society Vancouver, and brought artists like Warhol to Vancouver. And he also was friends with John Chamberlain, who he brought, Linda Benglis, and many other artists who he was very interested in. He was very research-based, and he was also was interested in the artists themselves. So it was not a passing curiosity. A lot of the works that he collected, he did quite weeks or months of research in advance, but then also nurtured these relationships as they unfolded. So we have a sort of classic Christopher Wool work here as well. And then we have a work by Gerhard Richter. This is an editioned work, and this was the last piece that Gerd collected. And this work is a sort of exemplar work called Tulips, which shows a kind of photo-conceptual basis for painting, kind of a classic conceptual painting work by Richter. And in the corner, last but not least, we have the small work by Cindy Sherman, one of two in the Metzdorff Collection, and just a lovely classical work as well from Sherman, from an Art Metropole edition, and Cindy Sherman as Lucille Ball. And just to talk a little bit more about that interest in drawing, again, it was across different media, but also sort of expanded media. So you can see in this Seurat piece, Alan Seurat piece, this kind of extended exploration of mark making only through the three-dimensional means, through this kind of wire sculpture. We have two other works by Seurat in the exhibition, a small sculptural work, and then also this drawing work, which was sort of like a cluster drawing done through holding a handful of colored pencils and then making marks with an idea that these could be also translated into sculptural works later. Also on this wall, we have a work by Kiki Smith and a self-portrait by Jim Dine. And this etching really shows this kind of, these are works that are sort of intense works. They're looking at that kind of edge of how self-representation might work. Both this Kiki Smith work and the Jim Dine work with the monochrome, but also work with representations of the self and representations of preoccupations of the self. So Kiki Smith was interested in ideas of sexuality, morality, and how they are expressed, how the body also represents these certain kind of obsessions. It's a site of obsession. And that is sort of carried through. So we see this work, Sin, part of N. Arezolo's work, his later conceptual works that were more text-based works. But it's interesting sort of theme that runs through Gert's collection, which is really looking at what are the acceptable edges of social life? What are the acceptable edges of how we coexist politically, culturally, philosophically? And you'll see that sort of running through, as well as his interrogation of popular culture that comes through a lot of these works. This Sven Erik Erikson piece from the early 1970s, it's from 1973, is just a broad view of the north side of Hastings Street. It's a very interesting kind of spliced image. Erikson was also an animator, and so this was intended originally to be the backdrop for an animation. But it also crystallizes this sort of sense of the urban fabric once again. So we see this kind of intersection, literally, of the street signage, this idea of certain kinds of economies, certain kinds of architectures, and certain experiences of the cityscape that kind of govern a number of the works in this collection, in this particular room. So we see that sort of understanding or interest in where that edge might be, and that interest in very bold kinds of intersections, interventions into the urban landscape and into the urban fabric by the work of these artists, and this kind of braveness and boldness to that work. And then we go to a work like this by Russell Crotty, which is a very formalist kind of work in many ways, but again, a kind of expanded drawing work. So in Russell Crotty's work, we see some of that minimalism, like the Vija Salmon's work, this kind of almost a landscape that seems to reflect the stars, that seems to be a kind of alternate landscape. And Crotty did a number of these works, these kind of globe works. So we see this kind of fusion of that extended sculptural and drawing practice, along with the minimalism of this repeated and mesmerizing mark. Similarly, we see something like that in this work here, which is a work by Ben Reeves, and it's a study for the Tower of Babel. So again, a repetitious kind of approach to mark making, and a really interesting approach to mark making, which enfolds us in these different kinds of sensations of movement and action, and yet at the same time we see this sort of abstraction of this form, and also the idea of the Tower of Babel itself, which is this sort of turning point in terms of this idea of a narrative of Western culture, of morality, and so there's again this kind of incisive questioning of where these sort of shapes for contemporary life might originate from. Again, a current in the work that sort of critiques that idea of popular life. So we move from this work by Ben Reeves over to a very interesting maquette work and a number of drawing works that are in Metzdorff's collection. This work by Robert Smithson is called L.A. Sprawl, and it's a work that was done toward the end of his life. And it's a drawing, a maquette, a study for a work that was intended to come later from 1972. So before Smithson's death in the plane crash in 1973, he was actually beginning to plan a project from his land art, one of his earthworks series for Los Angeles in conjunction with Douglas Christmas of Ace Gallery. And Ace Gallery also had an iteration in Vancouver at that time as well as Los Angeles. So this is a kind of hint as to what he was thinking of and what he might have done had he lived in terms of he wanted to do a piece like Spiral Jetty but on the land. And there's even some discussion that the piece would be done with palm trees. So there's a sort of palm spiral that was proposed as well. So it's just an interesting intersection and historical intersection where Gerd was there at the time, probably in conversation with Doug Christmas, who he knew, and was able to acquire this work. We have also this fantastic kind of study by Ken Lum for some of his sign work. So early on in his career, this is a 1987 work, and we know that also Gerd acquired one of the larger sign painting pieces from that series later, but this is a really great preamble to the kinds of motifs that Ken was working through. Again, thinking about urban fabric, thinking about signage, thinking about how these forms of communication fail in many ways to communicate. And interestingly, Gerd Metzdorff also studied linguistics and was interested in communications, and we can see how that translated into his interest in contemporary art and its capacity for communication as well. So here we have this work by Lee Bontekoe. It's a 1968 piece, and again, she's an artist, an American artist that was not as widely exhibited in Canada still to this day, has done a number of sort of extended paintings, sculptural works that have this kind of mandala-like quality, but this is quite an exquisite piece. Very subtle work, very subtle modulation, just a beautiful drawing, very much in the spirit of the Vija Salmons that we saw earlier. So again, we're seeing drawing in this collection from everywhere from a maquette to something that functions like a very fully realized final work. The Liu Fan work here is actually the first work that was collected by Gerd, and this is a work from 1973, and it's again a really interesting intersection between the gestural, sort of the painterly, and the conceptual. So in some ways the work is a little bit conceptually perhaps easier to enter into because we can definitely see the sense of the brushwork and the gesture and our understanding of painting and of art itself. But then, as we know, Ufan goes on to have this very complex conceptual practice which follows this. So really interesting to think of the bookends of the Li Ufan and finally the Richter piece in terms of the first and the last works in the collection. And along this wall we can see just a number of works that represent how pop art made itself known in Gerd's collection. So we can see this Jeff Koons work, very much looking again at signage, sort of following on from the Ken Lum, understanding how this sort of pop culture enters this sort of space of advertising, of sort of capturing the imagination. It's sort of got a billboard kind of feeling to it, something that can be seen from a great distance. And so we have these kind of bold works also by Roy Lichtenstein, and then we have these a little bit more subtle works by, this is a really interesting Linda Benglis work, which is a print piece, and we can see it's on handmade paper, kind of a unique work. There's a set of prints in the collection, and we're just showing one here. And this work, a little bit unusual for Benglis, that was a commissioned work that was given to Gerd in thanks, and they were friends, and Gerd had helped her with a particularly difficult negotiation with the dealer that she was having at that time, and she appreciated his support, and this was a gift to him at that time. Beside it, we see the Louise Bourgeois piece, one of her, a print by Louise Bourgeois, which shows some of her kind of signature forms that we see in her sculptural work as well, but also with that kind of pop kind of palette, so it's kind of an interesting work by Bourgeois. And then if we go a little bit over to the right, we see a collection of works by Warhol, and then a further work by Linda Benglis. Again, Linda Benglis, you can see how her work with materials, very unusual, so a very bold choice again for the time. This would have been in the 70s and early 80s that he was collecting this work. And this work shows a kind of drawing form, sort of drawing with materials, this kind of looping form, but also very unusual kind of combination of glass and sand and mesh works as well. So you can see how interesting that this kind of experimentation was for Gerd Metzdorff to look at this, these kind of material experiments and actually really celebrate them because they were unusual and bold. So similarly, I'll just have a quick look behind me. One of the things that attracted Gert to Warhol's work from my conversations with Grant Mann, who has been so generous in loaning the collection to us, Grant Mann and David Birdsall, who now own this collection. And we're longtime friends of Gert's as well. And initially, they had lots of conversation as Warhol's own collection came into auctions as Warhol had passed and his collection was becoming available to the public. And so they had long conversations about Warhol himself as a collector and how eclectic he had been, so that he collected way more works than he could possibly fit into his own living spaces, that it was done with this kind of passion and energy that really was about a curiosity about objects, about form, and also wide and eclectic. So his interest in Warhol, as much as for his work, was also for how Warhol also created a collection of his own. So coming out of the pop art pieces, some classic pieces here, self-portrait, the electric chair, the Mao work. We also see Christopher Wool's work here, which is a kind of post-conceptual piece, but coming out of this photo tradition, coming out of a painting tradition, so kind of like the next generation as well. So we see this work from the early 90s kind of bookended with Warhol's earlier works, and indeed some of the earlier conceptual works based on photography and printmaking and painting. This particular iteration of the collection is focusing mostly on photography, as well as photo-based print and printmaking, and some sculptural work. And our next show will be focused on painting in 2023. So here we see just the tip of the iceberg. So moving from this sort of post-conceptual work by Christopher Wool, I want to talk a little bit about an American artist named Judy Pfaff. Judy Pfaff is very well known for being one of the originators of installation art. Again, an artist that has not been as widely exhibited in Canada. And so just a really exciting example of what happened as Metzdorff was on his Vancouver to New York kind of assignment, and some of the work that he would have seen as he was looking at the galleries in New York at that time. And so Judy Pfaff, as you can see, is a combination of very painterly, but also printmaking, assemblage, and this kind of sculptural impulse in the work. Again, an artist, a female artist who represented, something that Gert was interested in, was just supporting women artists early on in their careers as well. So we see that once again if we look at the work of Linda Benglis. And this work, such an interesting combination of material practice, much like the Judy Pfaff work. Here we see this kind of high and low materiality. So we have plaster of Paris, armature, which is overlaid with gold leaf. So these two equally kind of fragile, archival kinds of materials sutured together in this really interesting way. that Benglis does of kind of finding her own sort of gesture. It very much seems like both a body and a fan, and precious, and also made of these very kind of banal materials as well, with the plaster of Paris. So just really interesting material explorations as well in Metzdorff's collection. That leads me to this work by Judith Shea. And Judith Shea was trained at Parsons as a fashion designer, and then later did a degree in visual arts. And in this work, it's very interesting. Obviously we see the reference to the body and to fashion, but then you can also see through these layerings this kind of a nod to op art, how very simply green and red overlaid on one another provide this kind of moire kind of revelation of brown. And so it's a really interesting kind of study of formalism at the same time as the materiality that we see in some of those earlier works. So we'll just have a look here at this work by Dan Flavin. And this is another example of Metzdorff's interest in minimalism and showing the kind of range in the collection in terms of sculpture work as well, but also in terms of his research. So this was purchased at auction, and about half of the works that Metzdorff collected were acquired through auction, as well as his visits to Dusseldorf and Cologne, to Art Basel, and to many of the different kind of gallerists that were in both Germany and also New York at that time. So we see this kind of following of this sort of research impulse. So this was acquired from a major Toronto collection. Originally the provenance was through Leo Castelli Gallery, where it was exhibited at the time that it was made. So we see in the collection sort of these major figures of American minimalism and post-minimalism, as well as pop art. And then this work by Tony Tassett, which is called Bench Progression. Just a really interesting play on Tassett's work was really interested in pop culture, Americana, kind of critically looking at ideas of American culture. So this is, again, an idea, a kind of intersection of that minimalist, post-minimalist, and pop together in one work. So really interesting example of the sculpture in the collection. And then we move to this work by Ian Wallace, so a major piece by a major Vancouver artist. So once again, we see Canadian art in the collection, and just a very significant example of Wallace's work. Again, looking at that kind of urban fabric, looking at this kind of nexus of where the street meets this kind of idea of a visual art tradition, the monochrome, this interest in painting and gesture, and you can see some relationship even to some of the drawing works that we saw earlier in the collection. So just a fantastic example of Ian Wallace's work here in Gert's collection. We're going to just move over to some other photo-based works. These ones that are European basis, so works by Thomas Roof, as well as Christoph Kludt, and a number of others. But on the way, we're going to just stop and have a quick look at this work by Robert Rauschenberg. And so two further iterations. So these are edition works, but they're also handmade paper. So a really kind of lovely, quite intimate exploration of by Robert Rauschenberg. So just a really interesting example of him thinking through a kind of material practice, thinking through materiality itself, layering, assemblage, and all of the kinds of licks that we find later in his major works. So just a lovely, intimate piece. And we're going to look here now at works by Thomas Roof. So these are works from the early 80s, so right at the beginning of Thomas Roof's exploration. Roof was a part of the Dusseldorf School, so his works come out of that tradition of Berndt and Hillebecker, where he had studied. And you can see the large format, his use of the large format printer, which means that we have a kind of grander than one-to-one, this massive scale encounter with this very kind of neutral expression. And again, this sort of minimalism, but now expressed through portraiture. So as we know, Roof often photographed people he knew in their own clothes, and they were asked to provide this kind of very neutral expression. Another example of his interest in photography we can see here through the work of Christoph Klute. And Klute was very interested in architecture, and he would often visit the same sites over and over again to create his photo series. These works are from the early 2000s, and more recent work he's been looking at architects that approach ideas of utopia in their works and photographing those sites. So we see this really kind of beautiful sinuous form that he seems to focus on in these. So again, a kind of formalism and tranquility and elegance to these works. So really interesting to think about this sort of tension throughout the collection between these sort of more formalist, quieter works of contemplation with the works that look at that kind of edgier side of life in terms of how we're constantly grappling with issues of selfhood in contemporary culture. Behind us, we're just going to look here at this work by Andreas Gursky. So we can imagine why that Gert was attracted to this image. And Gursky, also from the Dusseldorf School, known for suturing images together. So here we have this kind of desolate-looking parkscape intersected with the plain above it. And we see just sort of a really interesting, very early example. This is 1989 of this artist's work. And then if we look further over, we can see two more of the works by Christoph Klute, and then the second piece by Thomas Roof, and then a series of smaller works here on the wall. So we can just see the range of the collection here. So we have a work by Grant Mann at the top. Grant Mann is an artist who works with computer design and computer interface, and here a mathematical equation has been translated into this pictorial kind of form. So we have a mathematical equation now turned into this kind of seascape. So this very interesting use of photography and computer-assisted work. And then we have Ed Ruscha, of course, who was very much part of that school of looking at the ways in which contemporary Americana and ideas of the good life informed picture making in a kind of urban fabric. And so here we have just this very interesting kind of still life by Ed Ruscha, a bit of an unusual kind of assemblage. And here the small work by Andreas Gursky that shows this very quiet conversation among friends, which is quite a beautiful piece, and the piece I'd like to end on, as well as this work by Richard Archwager, which is kind of a bit of a visual pun of both a crate and a sculpture in one. And so here we see these kinds of really interesting experiments with what art can be and what art can do, all of the range of this collection, which gives us just a real peek into what we can imagine is this also very quiet and contemplative and thoughtful person who has drawn together such a wide variety of works in his own personal collection. So thank you so much for being with me today, and I look so forward to talking with you after the tour and answering any questions that you might have.